Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name's Dr. Doreen Miners, and if there is one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it is that there is no instruction manual for this device in our head. But there are patterns. There are patterns of thought, of feeling, of action, because that's the brain's job, creating the patterns that gracefully handle the predictable shapes of everyday life. And we call these things ideologies or biases or rituals, but there's something else that I've learned teaching this stuff. And that's that we are animals first. And as animals, you can't escape these patterns, but you can choose which ones to emphasize. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast, and you choose if it works for you. That's the idea. So let's get into it. Now, this is the third in my initial attempt here to turn my lectures into podcasts. And it's probably the last one I'm going to really polish. It's the last long intro, for example. I'll be happy to do away with that. And it's the last long session of editing too. You're just going to have to put up with my coughs and mumbles and whatnot from now on. But so far, it does seem like it's going down pretty well. I'm still spending more time getting them done than I've been hoping to, but I can still pump one out after a day of lecturing. So I'm going to keep it up. And once again, I want to respond to feedback. So the feedback coming in suggests that, as a baseline for new people coming in, I should be sure to go beyond the stuff that I'm teaching here as Associate Professor at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. And I should also go beyond the stuff I studied as a brain scientist at Cambridge and as a clinician. And in the feedback, one bit that I do keeps sort of coming up. This one bit that people seem to want to hear about is a bit on mundane cults. And since I've mentioned cults and Sandhurst in the same sort of verbal paragraph, I should probably be pretty clear that this is, as always, my own perspective and not the perspective of Sandhurst. It's just Dorian doing his little podcast. So, with that said, since this piece of mine on mundane cults is one of my favourites too, I thought I'd give it a go. And the background for this comes from a project I've been doing for a while now on human systems. And the best article I have on my website on this is called True Family Ties. I'll leave a note to that in my show notes. And it's probably worth its own podcast, that article. But what it essentially talks about, the main point, is that as a society, it's no secret that more people are lonelier than ever. We have many complaints of modern society, but growing isolation is a very common one. And there are a couple of reasons for this unhappy accident. There is, firstly, the difficulty, pragmatically, of finding people in an ever more crowded city. Where do you go to find them? How do you do it? But that aside, we also seem to have this problem where we routinely and systematically have lost sight of what a community is really made of. And I think that the way we talk about cults is one of the more, it's tangential for sure, but it is certainly one of the more entertaining examples of this. So let's get into it. Now, the word cult is an undeniably dirty word. It conjures images of hooded people in circles around fires. It conjures images of mass suicide, of self-harm, of tragic figures brainwashed to abandon their families. And it always conjures images of the infamous narcissistic leader. I mean, you just think of the Jonestown massacres in the 70s. Something like 900 people dead, either by murder or suicide, all members of Jim Jones' People's Temple, or Heaven's Gate. Marshall Applewhite's baby, 20 years later, 39 suicides by poison, all to chase, I think they called it the next level, and to marry up with Halley's Comet, which they believed was a UFO, some sort of alien transport. Or you think of Aum Shinrikyo, a Japanese doomsday cult that carried out a sarin gas attack on a Tokyo subway in 1995. They killed something like 13 people, but they injured thousands, right? And if we're not describing something this dramatic when we talk about cults, we are describing groups that we're wary of at a minimum. We talk about vegans as cult members when they're annoying us. Or we talk about fitness groups, fitness communities, like they're a training ground for zealots. Crypto is called cult-like pretty often now. And political factions, I mean, it's super trendy to make the link between political ideology and religious ideology these days. So political factions are cults too. So if it's not describing actual, spectacular and destructive cults. It's a sort of rhetorical bludgeon, a way to dismiss without engaging, to sort of pathologize people belonging to certain groups. And in my mind, this image of cults is a problem. It's the kind of problem that actually makes us more likely to fall victim to the destructive groups that gifted the word cult these connotations. Cults are better seen as, if not basic, then at least pervasive building blocks of the modern day experience. I reckon that there's every chance that you're in one right now, and there's every chance that you're actually better off for it, which in turn makes the likelihood that you might fall victim to a destructive version of the same thing even more likely if you keep using this term uncarefully. Now, I've got some convincing to do, I know that, but I want to start off with a bit of history because I think that it is maybe the most convincing thing, or it is the most convincing thing for me. The word cult started as a sociological classification. It was this sort of attempt of theologians to distinguish between different kinds of religious behaviour. In particular, they were using the word cult to carve out the groups that were emphasising the personal and private nature of religious beliefs, and particularly the people that were embracing the more mystical or ecstatic aspects of a connection to the divine. So we're talking here about the people that wanted that more personal, almost Gnostic connection to God. You know, in Christianity, these are the Pentecostals or the charismatic movements. In Judaism, it'd be the Kabbalah. In Islam, it'd be Sufism, right? The Sufis were quite interested in this, and so on. And all of this as opposed to more traditionally a connection to the community or to the church or to the priest and accessing God that way through the institution. And as time went on, this classification began to emphasize a feature that was often more common among those people who were more personally oriented or mystically inspired. And that's that they started to deviate from the mainstream. If you're going to pursue something that's more personal in the context of a religion, then you're more likely to break away from the predominant religious culture. You know, institutions have very little room for individuals. I mean, this is like a core thread of the Protestant Reformation. So the word cult for these sociologists was a way of distinguishing these people, mystically oriented and thus increasingly deviant from the mainstream. So there's that, and then there's this one final transformation that completes the history of the term cult, and that's the rise of the non-religious or the new religious movement. So you're thinking here of like spiritualism in the 1850s, or New Thought in the late 1800s, or the occult in the turn of the century. And then you have the human potential movement, you have neo-paganism and transhumanism, all these non-religious or new religious movements. So in an attempt to characterize the increasingly secular nature of these cults, the emphasis started to zoom out away from that religious nature of the groups, rather than considering how cults were defined by their adherence to or deviance from some established religion. They started to concentrate instead on the beliefs of the individuals. And it's here in this new sort of foray into the topic that we see a bit of a return to that first definitional use of the term. We're talking again about the personal nature of cultic beliefs. This became central again. Cults were seen to be ephemeral groups arising in response to the needs of some transient collection of individuals with pretty loose boundaries, with very little center of authority, you know. Sociologist Roy Wallis called this epistemic individualism, but I think illustrating it is probably better to help us understand what he meant. And I'll use neo-paganism for this because I'm pretty fond of it myself. So modern neo-paganism, including things like Wicca, right, modern witchcraft, or broader pagan-inspired movements, you know, Druidry is very popular here, neo-Druidry. All of these things emerged as a revival or a reconstruction of pre-Christian European religions. Although calling this a reconstruction is pretty loose. There's this guy, Ronald Hutton, who writes a lot about how we should treat the accuracy of these reconstructions. But the point is that unlike these older religious cults, to use air quotes, these newer groups often don't really have a formal hierarchy, right? You have covens or gatherings that form or dissolve flexibly. Or they lack central texts, for example. They have non-rigid orthodoxies, you know, ways of doing things that are pretty flexible. It's more focused on personal belief. You pick and choose and blend practices, deities, rituals, cosmologies. It's all about your personal preference, really. Certainly more so than conforming to a central dogma. I remember a Druidry course that skipped from chakras to Jung to Irish poetry, right? Which is something that I doubt we would have found in Caesar's accounts back when he was purging the Druids from Gaul. So everyone in these groups are negotiating their own spiritual truth, right? And that's it, more or less. Cults are, and they always have been, this combination. Groups that center on the needs of a loose collective of individuals that engage in religious behavior, and I'm going to return to that term a little bit later on, and that by the nature of their personalization, they often deviate from the mainstream. You might ask then, when did cult become such a dirty word? And deviation has its own connotations, and I talk about that more elsewhere, and I'll link to that in the show notes, but largely, I think it's because of marketing. Most people will trace the modern idea of cults back to Robert J. Lifton and Margaret Thaler Singer, two big academics in the topic. You see, during the Korean War, the Chinese were super effective at indoctrinating their prisoners of war. This is where the term brainwashing comes from, actually. They were so good at it, it was like they were washing all the wrong thoughts out of their head. It's actually a Chinese term that we adopted from them as a domain of research. And Lifton, writing on the topic, spoke to the idea of totalism, organizations and ideological movements that explicitly seek total control over human thought and behavior. And it's from this point where we started getting interested in it academically that we saw a rise in visibility of these high control and destructive groups from the 1960s or thereabouts all the way through the 1990s, culminating in the cases I talked about before, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, and the Manson family, another good example. Now, Singer, who was a brainwashing academic in her own right, spent a lot of this time in this period on TV or in the courtroom giving expert testimony, speaking about this phenomenon, brainwashing. And by the 90s, its popularity as a way to describe something quite negative culminated in these two books. Singer's own book, co-written with another author, Lalich, and forwarded by Robert Lifton. And this one was called Cults in Our Midst, The Hidden Menace in Our Everyday Life. And another by Stephen Hassan a couple of years earlier. And it was a best-selling guide to extracting people from these groups. He called it Combating Cult Mind Control, right? Both of these have cult in the title, which indicates that despite, Margaret Singer's book explicitly saying the term cult is not in itself pejorative, but simply descriptive, that it had become the word du jour for destructive cults. That early association with deviancy had become the association that stuck. But I hope you can see that by pushing back before the media panic of this late sort of 20th century period, you can see from the history that this isn't the critical feature of all cults, this brainwashing, destructive aspect. It's just the destructive ones. Rather, the critical feature of all cults is religious behavior. And there's that term again. So let me break it down for you. Now, it's important that we don't confuse religious behavior with religion. And in fact, this was the very aim of the cultic classification in the first place, right? To mark out groups that had replaced the mainstream religion with new beliefs. So religious behavior at its core is ritualistic behavior around some kind of article of faith. So I'll give you a couple of examples. You have religious behaviors that are around doing things. So prayer, for example, or making a sacrifice when you perform a service, if you're doing a pilgrimage or sacrificing an animal. These are rituals where you do things. And then you also have religious behaviors around not doing. So often these are sacrifices too, but ones where you give stuff up. So you might be fasting, for example, or you might adopt a set of purity rules, And in fact, in these not doings, there is this rich domain of taboos, actions that are forbidden for whatever reason the faith would have it so. So you have these ritualistic behaviors around faith where either you do or you don't do something as a consequence of that faith. That's what religious behavior is. And what's important about that definition is Whether you're a religious person or not, everybody engages in religious behavior. It's one of the things I talk about maybe the most on this website. And I'll link to a couple of my articles there in the show notes. But humans take a huge amount of things on faith, much more probably than we would care to admit. And in fact, we have to, right? I said it up the top, an impossibly complex world. We need graceful solutions to them. So we engage in religious behavior around articles of faith. And I'll give you a concrete example of this because I think it's the best example. It's our faith in the consciousness of other people. You see, under our current model of scientific enterprise, we don't have any way of assessing whether something is conscious or not. We each have some kind of experience of consciousness, but we'll never know if others share that experience with us, right? You'll never know if you were the only conscious being in a sea of automatons. But nobody behaves like this. Well, maybe not nobody, but you know what I mean. Instead, we all behave as though everybody else is conscious. You know, you could just take politeness as an example of this. Politeness is, at its core, a cluster of socially derived rituals of behavior that, at least in part necessarily assume others are conscious, right? It's a technically perfect example of religious behavior. And where religious behaviors collect, anywhere that they collect, cults are likely to emerge. You know, if you haven't heard somebody describe veganism as cult-like, then you haven't been in an Anglosphere city, because veganism is cult-like. Veganism at its core, when done for humane reasons anyway, is a set of religious behaviors centered around the consciousness of animals, right? It's an almost punitive collection of not doings that considers animal consciousness. And in support of these faithful efforts, this transient, leaderless collective sprung up to meet the needs of vegans, to help insulate them as they deviated from the mainstream views on animal consciousness in the process. And importantly, I'm not saying any of this to be pejorative. If anything, it seems like we're moving closer to vegans on average for all sorts of reasons, right? But what is true is that being a vegan would be pretty hard without the cult of veganism. My mum, for example, had to give up being a vegan in the 90s before it was so established. So what I'm trying to say here is that cults are defined by this kind of religious behavior. Now, there's another example I think is worth mentioning just to drive the point home, and that's the world of health and nutrition. It is extraordinarily fertile soil for the development of cults. And that's because almost nobody seems to have a good idea about how nutrition works outside of the basic sort of macronutrient profile. And health is almost as much of a crapshoot, right? I've talked before, and I'll link to that in the show notes, about how much of a failure modern therapy is, for example. And I've also written about our weirdly quixotic relationship with the world of medicine, right? It's almost entirely faith-based because none of us have the time to become doctors, you know? So it's no surprise the realm of health and well-being is a treasure trove of cultic movements. And here you have everything from the neo-pagan religions that I was talking about before, to loose-knit groups of crystal healers, to communities that populate websites like Goop or any number of topical substacks, to franchises like F45, right, or CrossFit. All of these loose collectives of people are creating a personal relationship with health, and they are supporting each other through the religious behavior that's oriented around a health-related faith that deviates from the mainstream, right? They're cults, technically, you know, and again, none of this is pejorative. I'm pointing out, or I'm trying to very explicitly, that this describes both healthy groups and problematic ones. And I hope I've convinced you by this point, but I'm also suspecting that you're starting to wonder why you should care, right? Why am I trying so hard to reclaim the word cult? You know, we don't care about all cults. We care just about destructive ones. And I think that that's a good question, but I think it's not quite the right question. I think it's not quite the right cut. So let me do a final bit to wrap up with a little explanation, and then I'll let you go. Now, I've talked elsewhere about how our attraction to destructive and spectacular cults distracts us from the real and important dynamics of these things. And I'll link to that article in the show notes, but I hope that I've illustrated some of that here. But one of the things I haven't talked about so much is that there is this notion that a charismatic leader is required to make a cult whole. And clearly there is a role of charisma in a cult. I mean, obviously there's got to be the charisma of some new article of faith, right? The core of the religious behaviors that engendered the cult in the first place. And then you're going to get charismatic leaders that embody that charisma, right? Leaders in the Weberian sense. And what I mean by that is leaders who either through their religious behavior, like Singer and Lalich talk about, or through their aggression seem exceptional or become prominent, or just by being in the right place at the right time, and they attract a following. And these kinds of leaders are a feature of any kind of novel environment. They are points of light in the dark. And this is what Weber says about them. This is where charisma shines as a guiding force before the structure that really solidifies the group starts to emerge. But what's notable is that charismatic leaders rarely rise to the top of these loose collectives. It's often true of the spectacular cults we've talked about, but it doesn't normally happen. Normally leaders serve as eddies and currents in this more transient cultic milieu. Like, who's the leader of the vegans? You wouldn't be able to name somebody, or certainly I wouldn't. And as Weber noted, charismatic leadership will eventually give way to more traditional or rational leadership as the cult begins to require structure and its growth creates its own mainstream presence. All of this to say that it's not that these structures can't be problematic or charismatic leaders can't ruin them. There is a reason that Lifton was worried about totalizing organizations and that Singer was worried about their leadership. Authoritarian structure in high control groups is something we should be worried about. But what we shouldn't be worried about is cults. Cults are just communities that are organized around shared values that engage in religious behavior around those values, right? We need to strip cult of its dark mystique and point our concern at the things that actually matter, or otherwise we're going to risk misidentifying a good cult as a bad one, or much, much worse, we're going to risk failing to recognize a bad one because it seems good. So with that out of the way, I want to bring it back to my interest in human systems, right? This problem of rising loneliness and isolation in modern cities. And I said it before, I spent a lot of time noting that a reason for this is because we seem to often be missing the factors that really bind communities together. And cults, mundane cults like the ones I've described, are some of the most obvious examples of community left in a modern world. Mundane cults describe many loose collectives where people come together, either in person or online, to share their values, their beliefs, to share their faith in things that an increasingly specialized world makes difficult to understand. And then they share rituals around their faith, and in doing so, they find their people, right? And this is why in the academic world, cults which aren't destructive or totalistic are seen as a place of value, a place where you can go and you can find affiliation and spiritual fulfillment, a place where you can find community and purpose in a world that often sidelines these things in favor of individual productivity. So that's it. That's my challenge to you. Stop using the word cult as a dirty word. If you're not in one or two or even a handful, then you're probably doing something a little weird. The real question isn't that. The real question is, are the cults you're in cults you're choosing to be in? Because if you're not asking that question, then you're exactly the kind of person who's likely to end up in a circle of hooded figures. I'll leave you with that.